Meeting is being recorded.
All right. So we've been making our journey through the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is introduced right away in the Gospel of Mark as the Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so this is the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. We're introduced to the one who comes before him, John the Baptist, and then Jesus comes on the scene and he begins preaching through proclaiming his message of the repentance because the kingdom of God has come near. And so this good news causes us to have this specific response that Jesus calls for of repentance and believing it and having faith in it. And so he calls disciples to follow after him. We see his authority as he teaches and he drives out demons and he heals the sick in various places. We see that leads to conflict then with those who are in authority, particularly the religious authorities over several questions particularly about the Sabbath and what it's appropriate to do or not to do on those days, and about the forgiveness of sins and who has the authority to do that. And it all points, though, to the fact that Jesus is the one who is bringing the kingdom of God, that in him, the kingdom of God has come near as the Son of God, as the Christ, the one who is anointed of God. And even his own family begins to say that he's crazy. But in the midst of that craziness that they purport him, Jesus then kind of changes what the requirements are to be a member of his family, and it has to do with those who obey the will of God and do the will of God. They are the ones who are truly, he says, my brother and my family, my siblings. And so that's what Jesus redefines family as. And then Jesus begins to teach in parables. We saw the parables in chapter 4. Chapter 5 leads us on to various miracle stories, the healing of the demoniac, which continues the healings, but this time it's slightly different because it's outside of Israel. And this man who wants to follow Jesus is told to go back and tell people what the Lord has done for him. And he does that. And then Jesus comes and heals we have Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. Jesus comes home, he's rejected. And then where we picked up and ended last time, Jesus had sent his disciples out to go into the villages to teach and to drive out the unclean spirits. And we saw that they did that and that they faithfully went out. They cast out demons, it said, and they anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. And a couple of things that we mentioned last time in the midst of this. This is yet another example of Mark's, we call it the sandwich technique or the envelope technique. The technical word for it is intercalation, but we don't have to remember that. But it's this idea where Mark starts a story and then he inserts another story in the middle of it, and then he ends the story. We saw this several times. The best example that really so far has been the Jairus' daughter. He goes to heal the daughter. While he's on the way, we have the woman with the issue of blood right in the center of that. And then Jesus finishes the story. Mark finishes the story as Jesus heals Jairus' daughter, raises her from the dead. So we have that sandwich technique. The same thing here. We're going to see tonight is Jesus sends out the 12. They go out. And while they're out, Mark then tells the story that we're going to read next, which is about John the Baptist. We have the story of John the Baptist, and then Mark ends the story of the sending of the 12 in verse 30. And so again, we have an example of Mark telling the story in two parts and dividing the story with another story inserted in the middle. And whenever that happens, it causes us to ask, why did Mark do that? Normally, it's because he wants to highlight something about both stories by bringing these stories together. And so we'll ask that question as we come to the end of our next section. So if someone would read, we're going to start tonight in verse 14 and go down to verse 29 of chapter 6. So if someone would read that, please.
I can.
Thank you, Martha.
Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John whom I beheaded. He has been risen from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias and his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. For John said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a feast for the nobles and the high officers and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, and the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom. So she went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask? And he said, the head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry. Yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. And immediately the king sent out an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. And when the disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb.
Such an uplifting story. Thank you, Martha. It is so Mark tells us the story of the sending of the 12, and then we get to hear about Herod's reaction to this, and then it leads us to kind of this back kind of a flashback of how John died. And so we're kind of introduced to the story that way. So the first thing is King Herod hears of the fame that's spreading about Jesus, and his first thought is John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and these powers are at work in him. And so he's really fearful about that, which shows his fear. Of course, others are saying it's one of the other prophets. It might be Elijah or one of these other figures that might have been from the Old Testament. But Herod is pretty much convinced. He says, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. So he is convinced that Jesus is John the Baptist raised from the dead. And then we're told why King Herod might be concerned about this. So first of all, a couple things to kind of set this in place is who was Herod? In fact, he wasn't technically a king. He was a tetrarch or over a portion of Galilee and Perea, which were certain regions that were within Palestine. So Galilee, and then this region that was east of the Jordan River. And he was a ruler over that. He was the son of Herod the Great. And so several of Herod's sons were rulers that were over different portions of the region. And he is the one who is involved here. And he has an issue with John. He arrested John. Why is it that he initially arrests John?
Because John said he shouldn't have married his brother's wife.
John is calling him out on this issue of marrying his brother's wife, which in fact was forbidden by the Old Testament law if your brother was living. So this is this issue of divorce, and then she divorces the one husband and marries the other. This family history is pretty messed up. You have to think of this. So Herodotus herself, so notice that her name is a form of Herod. She was the granddaughter of Herod the Great. Her first husband was the son of Herod the Great, hence her uncle. So she marries her uncle. Then she divorced that uncle and married his half-brother, this guy who's named Herod Antipas. So she married her other uncle. So she must have really had a thing for her uncles. And so there was a lot of those uncles around too, because Herod the Great had 10 wives and a whole bunch of offspring with those 10 wives. So this is all very crazy. And then we have in the story Herodotus's daughter who enters into the story. So think about this. Herodotus's daughter was at the same time Herod Antipas's niece on her father's side, right? It was his grandniece on her mother's side and his stepdaughter. Wow, this is a lot of family drama that's going on here, but that's shows kind of how messed up things were in the Herod family. And so John comes kind of calling out some of these sins that they have been involved in, and as a result of that, he is put into prison. Now it's interesting. There's this word. Herod himself sent out in verse 17 men who arrested John. There's this idea that the same verb there is used for where Jesus sent out the disciples. So there's sending in both stories. There's this sense of Herod does kind of a demonic sending, if you will, in the way that he sends and arrests for and binds John the Baptist, whereas Jesus is sending his disciples out on a mission of healing, but Herod is sending out as well. So John calls him out. As a result of that, Herodotus really has a grudge against him. And we're told that she wanted to kill him, but she couldn't, because Herod actually was fearful of John. He feared John because he knew that he was righteous and holy. And as a result of knowing that John was righteous and holy, he protected him, and he enjoyed listening to him, even though it says that it kind of was sometimes perplexing, the things that John said, but he liked to hear about them. And so John then is put to death ultimately by this guy who recognizes that he was a righteous and holy, but who succumbed to public pressure. So John, meanwhile, is still remaining faithful to his task. He's preaching repentance and God's forgiveness. And John's judgment of Herod's marriage is a public call that sinfulness be recognized, and that sinfulness that Herod was involved in. So much of this is pointing to Jesus's death. Think about that. Think about the parallels that are involved here. Jesus is put to death also by a ruler who recognizes that he is good. We're thinking of Pilate, of course, but ultimately succumbs to public pressure. But there is a difference in this story. And the difference is that after the slaying of John and the presentation of his head, Mark's account of John's death closes with his disciples actually taking the body and laying it in a tomb. So John is buried by his disciples. Jesus will ultimately be abandoned by all of his disciples, except for these religious leaders who come and actually Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who actually ultimately are involved in that. But his disciples actually abandon him. And so here we have John's disciples coming and burying him. But this whole thing is very told in a very dark fashion, of course, all these ideas of what happens that Herodotus finds her opportunity to kill John by taking advantage of a promise that Herod made to his stepdaughter to give her whatever she wanted. The stepdaughter evidently can't think for herself, so she goes right to mom, and mom tells her what she wants, and then immediately then that head is brought to her, and they begin passing the head around. That's really dark. It's not just that they got the head, but the head was brought on a platter. He hands it to the girl then hands it to her mom. It's this passing around of the head, and it's this dark story. So why do you think, in the middle of this mission of the 12, this mission of the disciples, why does John tell us this story?
I think it's going to be dangerous for them. It's going to require a major commitment from them.
So the dangerous aspect of them, you're referring to disciples, readers of Mark's gospel?
I mean, the disciples of Jesus.
Jesus's disciples.
Going out to preach as John and Jesus are doing.
Mm-hmm.
This is a lesson that this is not going to be an easy path. That's one idea.
Yeah, no, and I think that's great. So this idea of a lesson for Jesus's followers, of the cost of following him, the challenge of following him.
Maybe it's a premonition for Jesus.
So premonition, or pointing to Jesus and what's going to happen to him.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
I guess I also see a strong contrast. I don't know, but from the disciples' standpoint, that's pretty heady. You get to go out and you get to have control over demons, and you get to heal these people, and you get to do all these wonderful things. And yeah, but on the other hand, there is a price to be paid. You may not be paying it, but certainly others are when you're doing the Lord's work.
Yeah, I think that's good too. So you have this contrast between the success of their ministry at this point and the price that John pays. Any other thoughts on why John might insert this story? I think you're all correct, because I think it's all there. I think all of that is clear. First of all, John, there's this parallel between John, who is preaching and proclaiming the kingdom, and the disciples who are going out and preaching and proclaiming the kingdom. And he continues unswervingly in that mission, even to the point of death. It cost him his life. And there's this idea that discipleship, and Jesus is going to talk about this as we move forward in the gospel a lot, that discipleship is costly. In fact, it can even cost you your own life. And discipleship itself will cost no less than everything. And so there's that part in it. The other part, I think, is it's prefiguring, as Bud said, this idea that the life and death of Jesus, that this is showing us kind of what the future holds, not only for Jesus' disciples, but for Jesus himself, that he is going to, this is the fate of Jesus. And so this is an opportunity, by reflecting on what happened to John the Baptist, to also point us forward to what's going to happen to Jesus and prepare us for that. And that's the way in which Jesus's mission will ultimately be fulfilled. And so I think, and then I do think you have this contrast, because this is okay at this point. There it says they're being successful as they're going out and casting out demons and anointing the sick, but the Christian life and this walk of discipleship is not always going to be one of success. It also is one of cost. And so all that is coming in together. And so I think John's martyrdom here is not only prefiguring Jesus's death, it's prefiguring the death of anyone who would come after him, and pointing us to that that cost of discipleship for sure. So that's what we see in this section. Verse 30, then John's story is kind of in the background, and we're back to the story that we started with, which was the sending out of the 12. And verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. So here, those who were sent out back in verse 7, they return and they make their report to Jesus. Do you what do you notice or observe about that, of what they tell him?
Told him
Anything catch your
everything.
attention? What?
It told him everything.
So you
that
have
they had
everything.
done. Yeah.
So it's all. So they're focusing
All.
on this, which all is actually one of Mark's favorite words. It's going to enter into a lot of the stories to come here.
I noticed too that when they say told him all things, that reminds me of a child coming to a parent and just telling them everything.
Mhm.
To me, it speaks of their relationship with him.
Yeah, and they certainly have that relationship, and I think that's certainly denoted in the fact that they're gathering around Jesus, remembering that the disciples were those who gather around Jesus. They're these new members of his family, and that relationship is being highlighted.
They use the term apostles instead of disciples.
That's an interesting observation, which is true. That this is, it was earlier in verse 7, it was called the 12. Elsewhere, they've been called the disciples that he gathered around them. And here it's called the apostles, which apostles, does anyone know what that word apostles means?
Those sent.
Sent out. Yeah, those who are sent out. So yeah, this is this idea of the apostles being those sent out. So very appropriate, as they've been sent out, now they come back as those who were sent out. And so this is that beginning to be called kind of that apostle mindset here, that this term, which, by the way, there's a sense in which that's the apostles are the 12 in particular at sometimes, and then there's the apostles that are those that are generally sent out. So it's not limited necessarily to the apostles in other usage. Any other observations about this report?
They had been so busy they didn't even have time to eat.
Yeah, well, we're going to be told that in a minute about this.
The fact that they gathered themselves together to Jesus rather than one or two or leaving anybody out, they just all came to him.
Mm-hmm. They're all there. So what they tell him is this: all that they had done and taught. Very interesting that basically they're announcing their achievements to Jesus. Despite the focus upon Jesus as the one who authorized and sent them in verses 7 through 13, they report everything that they did and everything that they said.
You got to take credit.
Yeah, that's what's happening here. You see that? It's kind of just a small little thing, but the fact of who that they, everything they did and everything they said, that here it's kind of interesting is they are missing kind of the point of this is what God does through them. This is what Jesus is doing through them, as he's the one who sent them and authorized their mission. And yet they're kind of taking the credit in a sense. And so there's this idea in which even here, the disciples are missing what it's really all about. And that's going to come to even more into more relief as we move forward in the story. But but we have this idea that they're missing out on what the essential qualities of true discipleship. And that was just made clear, by the way, in John's death, that because we have these two stories together, John the Baptist's death points to the paradox that the miraculous successes of Christian missionaries are going to be made possible by the suffering death of Jesus, to which John's death points forward. And so ultimately, Jesus is the one who makes it all possible. And so it's kind of just an interesting grammatical note there. They reported everything that they did and everything that they had said or taught.
Were they bragging about the power that he'd given them?
Maybe.
You know, I mean,
We don't want to read a whole lot, but it seems to be maybe a little bit of what they're saying in this sense.
That may go
All
back-
right. If someone would read verses, we're going to move into our next story. So think about this. We just had a feast. It was the feast where John the Baptist is beheaded. It's Herod's birthday party. Now we're going to have another feast, and we'll contrast these two feasts. But let's read verses 31 to 44. Someone would read that section.
I will.
Thank you, Betty.
Then because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leave and recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time, it was late in the day, so his disciple came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year of wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000.
Thank you, Betty. So Jesus instructs the disciples to leave their present location and go to this other place to rest. And they head to what is called, in some translations, a deserted place, a lonely place. The word here is desert. It's the same word that we had when Jesus goes into the wilderness or the desert back in chapter 1. And so, but they go to this place, and it means that they went away by boat to this place, it says. And so they take this trip across the water, and but it actually is not a successful excursion because they're going to basically get away from the crowds, but their destination is known. And so many gather. They run on foot, it says, from all the towns, and they beat Jesus there. They're waiting for them as Jesus and his disciples upon their arrival. Now, Jesus comes ashore and he sees the crowd. And what does Mark tell us is Jesus's reaction?
Moved with compassion.
He was moved with compassion. So he had compassion for them. And so note that what Jesus's attitude here is an attitude of compassion. And then John clarifies the other way that he saw them along those lines. And what does he say he saw them as?
Sheep
Without
without
a
a shepherd.
shepherd.
So sheep without a shepherd. And so we see this word. Now, that's an interesting phrase. In and of itself speaks to this fact that sheep without a shepherd would seem to mean those who are wandering, those who don't have leadership. Shepherd was, of course, a metaphor for leadership and one who would lead and guide others. And so there are people that are kind of wandering without a shepherd, without someone to lead them. It's important that we also recognize that this phrase has a lot of Old Testament kind of overtones, and specifically an allusion to Numbers chapter 27:17, when God says to Moses that he doesn't want Israel to be like sheep without a shepherd. And we see throughout the Old Testament then that there's kind of this metaphor of sheep referring to the children of Israel, and sometimes how they have bad shepherds, but ultimately how God, the Lord, is their shepherd who leads them and guides them. When we think of shepherds in the Old Testament, we sometimes think of people like David, for sure, as a shepherd. But what if we say shepherd in the Old Testament? What is one of the first thing that always comes to mind?
Psalm 23.
The 23rd Psalm. And think about the 23rd Psalm is in the background a lot within this passage, and think about that as a kind of a Old Testament background to what's going on here. Because as this scene proceeds, Jesus becomes the Lord and shepherd of his people, and he's also demonstrating to the disciples that they too are called to be sheep, that shepherds, they too are called to be shepherds that care for the sheep. And he demonstrates that in this story. So the first thing we see is he sees them, and because he saw them like sheep without a shepherd, and because he had compassion, what's the first thing he does?
He
Teaches them.
He taught, yeah. So we
Yeah.
see this, that's what Jesus has been doing since the beginning of the book of Mark. That was in the first chapters, as he was demonstrating his authority. We saw that he did that as he taught. We saw that he taught his disciples in parables, and he taught those who were members of his new family. And here, because he had compassion, he begins to teach them. And so this teaching ministry comes. And then it says that it grew very late. And so Jesus is having compassion. And the first word that we hear from the disciples is, "Hey, Jesus, it's getting late. We're in this remote place, so send the people away." So you see the difference between kind of these two reactions of Jesus, who's like, "Oh, these are sheep without a shepherd. Let me have compassion. Let me gather them. Let me teach them." And the disciples are like, "We got to send them away, and because it's getting late, and they need to go buy themselves something to eat." And how does Jesus respond to that kind of disciples?
You said, give them something to eat. You said, let's feed them.
He turns it on the disciples, right? And
Yes.
in the Greek, it's actually very, there's really emphasized is you give them something to eat yourselves. That's really a contrast. What did they just say? Dismiss them so that they can go buy food for themselves.
Right.
And so this contrast between themselves, no, you don't send them to find food, you give them food yourselves.
Right.
And so he's saying to the disciples, no, you're the ones who can provide this food for them. And the disciples' response seems rather sarcastic here. And if you don't pick up on that tone, but it truly is really a kind of a sarcastic tone. And they say, are we supposed to go out and buy 200 denarii worth of bread? I like the translation, Betty. I think you said half a year's wages or something like that.
Yes.
Which, yeah, a denarius would be equal to about a day's wages. So you're looking at 200 days wages, so about half a year or more wages. So yeah, so they're saying it's going to take a large amount of money to feed this crowd. Notice that the disciples are continuing the misunderstanding that's happening here again. They're not understanding Jesus. They're not understanding where Jesus is taking this. And that reply indicates that the disciples still don't get Jesus. Their focus is on what they possess or don't possess. And Jesus's focus is totally on not what they have in their possession, but on what they can do. And so he asked them, okay, and he kind of avoids their sarcastic response, and he says, okay, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And so they go and they respond, they have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Another interesting thing in chapter 6, as we're kind of coming here on this emphasis on bread, remember in back in the beginning of the chapter in 6 verse 8, Jesus sends the disciples out on a mission, and he told them, what did he tell them to take with them?
No
Staff.
bread.
No bread.
No bread.
That's right.
No bread,
So
no
he
copper.
told them to take the staff and there was something else there, right? That they were supposed to take tunics. Let's see, I don't wear sandals, and they were supposed to have a staff, but no bread, no bag, and no money. So they weren't supposed to take any of that. And what happened as they went? They had their needs met. They witnessed God's miraculous provision and how God provided for them. Now the disciples are focused only on the impossibility of the situation, but they're failing to see that God can work and God can provide for them even when they don't have the necessary means. And so they tell Jesus, we found these 5 loaves and these 2 fish. And so then Jesus does something interesting. He tells all the people to sit down in groups. And we're told that something specific then in verse 40 about those groups, that they're groups of hundreds and fifties. In the Old Testament, this idea of hundreds and fifties, that reflected the companies that the Israelites were to be in as they marched in the desert. Exodus chapter 18 talks about this as they put the Israelites into groups of hundreds and fifties. It's also referenced in Numbers 31 and Deuteronomy 1. So there's this idea, this resonance then with the Old Testament march in the desert. So Jesus is arranging them and putting them into groups. And the word there in Greek is a symposio, which has to do with he's getting them ready for a feast. And so Jesus is putting them into this position to receive a feast. But Mark notes something else interesting, and he says that they were on the grass, but he doesn't just say grass, does he?
Green
Green grass. Why green grass?
time of year.
Sheep need green grass.
So sheep need green grass.
They were in a deserted place, so green grass would be unusual there.
Maybe in a desert, you wouldn't expect green grass, so that would be part of it.
Just back to the 23rd Psalm again.
The 23rd Psalm. What's it say? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me in
Green pastures.
green pastures. So, this is another allusion to that 23rd Psalm. Again, pointing out to just as Jesus had compassion upon the crowd, seeing them as sheep without a shepherd, now he is acting as the shepherd to them, pointing us out that he's the shepherd who is providing for his sheep. Then Jesus does several actions. So verse 41, he takes, he blessed, he looked up first, then he blessed, then he broke, and then he gave. Do those actions remind you of anything?
Last Supper.
The Last Supper. So we have here, I think, a clear pointing us forward to the Last Supper, to the communion meal. And so here is this is an allusion to that as well. So Jesus he looks up, he blesses, he broke, and he gave. All actions that remind us of the Lord's Supper.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting thing, though, is that what he does, Jesus doesn't actually give the food to the people.
No,
He gives them to his
his
disciples.
disciples.
He gives them to the disciples in order that they might set them before the people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that detail is pretty interesting because rather than just kind of dismissing the disciples as failures for not getting him, they actually become the means by which Jesus blesses the people. They become his agents of blessing. Even though they don't get Jesus, Jesus is still using them to share his provision with the people. And so that's pretty cool, that even when you don't get Jesus, Jesus can still use you for his kingdom. And so they misunderstand, they don't get him, but Jesus makes them agents of his blessing. And so he also fulfills, remember what he said, you give them something to eat.
Right.
He allows that to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
They in fact do that. So so they did that, and then they divided the fish. Jesus divided the fish among them all. And then verse 42, I love, because it says they all ate and were filled, or some translations say satisfied, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, we think about satisfied, and this is Psalm 23 stated positively. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Again, in other words, the Lord is my shepherd, I'm satisfied. And so that's the idea here. But it's also reminding us, remember of the gift of manna in the desert, as Jesus would, the Lord God in the Old Testament would provide for them, that each day they would have their fill, it says. Each day they would be satisfied. So this is the same idea here, that just as the manna would come. But here's a significant difference between the manna and this meal. And that is
Leftovers.
Leftovers. Yes, the leftovers are the big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the Old Testament, as they're traveling in the wilderness and they're having manna, they're not allowed to keep any for the next day. They're to trust God's provision and that God will provide again the next day. But here, Jesus actually has the disciples gather the leftovers, and they fill, by the way, how many baskets?
12.
12, which would remind us of
12 tribes.
the 12 tribes. Would be the Old Testament correlation. 12 also is the 12 disciples. It's the number of the people of God. And so here is pointing us to that fact. And so here are these people, this crowd, which came from all the towns of Israel, it says, but there's leftovers. It means there's more than enough to go around. So God provides and has more than enough provision. And I think the fact of leftovers is pointing to the fact that there's still some left for us too. There's still room at this table, that the nourishment generated by Jesus is still available in those 12 baskets. And we have all these references here to several things. The references to the fact of Jesus being the shepherd. He's the good shepherd. But we also have all this imagery related to the Exodus. And so the gift of food in the desert. Remember the gift of food in the wilderness in the Old Testament, the manna in the wilderness. But unlike those manna stories where the manna could not be kept from day to day, this bread is given by Jesus. It is collected so that it continues to remain available. And Jesus is showing us that he's bringing about a new Exodus, a new deliverance. Just as Moses led the people in the wilderness, so now Jesus is leading the people to salvation, but it's an even greater Exodus It's even greater salvation. It's even greater deliverance than that was provided in the Old Testament. There's one other Old Testament overtone that you could pick up on this story too, that points to kind of this miraculous provision. And that's a story that happens in 2 Kings chapter 4. There's a story of Elisha. He commands his servants to give barley loaves and new grain so that his prophets, the people, have something to eat. And the servant says, we don't have enough food to feed 100 men. And Elisha repeats that command, and he concludes, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat, and there will be some left over. And in that story, there was. And I think this is also pointing to God's miraculous provision. It's more than enough. And then the last thing here is Mark tells us how many actually ate. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered, and all your translations probably say 5,000 men. It doesn't say 5,000 people, because it's very clearly the men that are being counted. Now, there could be several reasons for that, but it's pointing out that there was a large group. The fact is that they probably weren't all men, that there were 5,000 men, and that doesn't include the women and children that were also present. And so this is a miracle of great magnitude, that 5,000 people could be fed with 5 loaves, 2 fish, and you have 12 basketfuls left over. So observations or questions on that story?
I noticed that Jesus had a purpose for everything he did in that passage. I guess I mean to say he didn't do anything for no reason.
Yeah, it seems like all of what he says is very intentional. The words that he says to the disciples, everything kind of sets that up, doesn't it?
Hmm.
And his actions, which Mark really highlights with those verbs, everything that he did, which really highlights, I think, that the fact that Jesus is the actor here and then uses his disciples to carry it out. It's not unlike the sense in which Jesus is the one who calls them and sends them out on the mission in the same way as he sent them on that mission to heal and to drive out the unclean spirits. So pretty interesting point there, that Jesus is the one who's in charge, but then he calls those who are following him to be part of that mission. The other thing, and these are just, it's kind of a grisly thing, but I think the contrast between the banquet of Herod that leads to death and the banquet of Jesus that's leading to life and to nourishment. I mean, they're passing out things at both. One's a head and the other is bread and fish. And so you have all these contrasts, and it's kind of interesting to see how different these two meals are. But I think there is, in a sense, a contrast between the meals that are present. All right, let's finish. Go ahead.
I'm confused about that line 52. They were utterly astounded by what happened. They fed all the people with bread and fish. But they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Why were their hearts hardened?
Yeah.
What thing happened?
So let's look at that, because it's an interesting thing, because what verse 52 does is reflects back on this story of the 5,000. But the irony is that is after another miracle. So let's read that story, and then we can come back to that, because what happens in this low that they don't understand, and as a result, their hearts were hardened. So that leads us then. So let's finish out this chapter 45 through 56. Someone will read that, and then hopefully we can answer that question, or try to.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them and said to them, Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. And they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. And when they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, ran through, through that whole surrounding region, and began to carry about on beds those who were sick, to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he entered into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch the border of his garment, and as many as touched him were made well.
Thank you, Susan. So we get John's, I do that a lot, don't I? Mark's favorite word, immediately. So immediately after that miracle was done, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. That's an interesting word. It's not like the disciples are like, hey, let's go. He forces them to get into the boat. Jesus is the one who kind of pushes them into this storm, which is an interesting thing. So he makes them get into the boat and go ahead to the other side. He dismisses the crowd. He says farewell. And then Jesus goes up on a mountain to pray. I think a mountain is significant. What might a mountain make us think about?
Transfiguration.
The Transfiguration would be one of the events that it will be happening in John's and Mark's account. I don't know why I keep saying John, but in Mark's account, yes, it will happen at the Transfiguration. And the Transfiguration, I think, also points to this. What other resonances?
Sinai.
Moses and the law.
So yeah, you both said this in different ways. Susan says Sinai and Bud says Moses. So the fact is that this mountain where Moses encounters God. So again, we're coming off of all of these Exodus motifs that we saw in the feeding of the 5,000. And now again, we're having this idea of a mountain, which gives us this idea of an Exodus motif again. So Jesus goes up on a mountain to pray. He's been seeking time alone for a while, and he finally has that time. But when evening came, he says the boat was out in the sea and he was alone on the land. And so the disciples are out on the sea. Jesus is alone on land. And then it says that it was the fourth watch or so. And that was, this was early in the morning. So this would be like between 3 and 6 a.m. That is in the morning. So it was in the darkness of the fourth watch. It says Jesus came to them across the sea. So he sees them straining. He sees the adverse wind. And he came towards them. It says walking on the sea, which reminds us of Psalms that talk about God being the one who walks on the sea in the Old Testament. So that's an important connection there. But then not only that, but the end of verse 48 is curious. So it says he's walking on the sea, but what does verse 48 say?
And he would have passed them.
Pass them by.
Yeah. He wanted to, or he intended to pass them by. That's not what we would expect to see. We expect to see, oh, Jesus sees them struggling at the oars and he sees these adverse winds, and Jesus came to them on the sea to save them. But it says, no, Jesus came to pass them by. What's Jesus doing?
Letting them figure it out.
So is it a test to let them figure it out? Is that partially maybe what he's going? Could be a possibility. What else? Any other reasons that Jesus would intend to pass them by?
Their own lack of faith.
Because they lacked faith? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
And he realizes that. We do have other stories where because of lack of faith, he was unable to do many miracles. We saw that in earlier stories, Nazareth. Other thoughts?
but
So it's-
what I noticed too is that he's walking on the sea in their general direction. So he must have known exactly where they were as he was walking toward them.
Yeah, there's a way in which Jesus is able to know exactly where they were, even though this is a chaotic situation, evidently, because of the way that they're straining at the oars and the wind. And he's able to see and know exactly where they are. I think there's some supernatural sight and idea that's coming in there.
But when it first happened, he was on the mountain, so maybe he could see what was on the sea.
So there is a possibility that he's able to see from his vantage point as well. This idea of passing them by. So some scholars say some of the things you guys have said, intended as a test of their faith, or he was going to pass them by because of the lack of faith. But there's another possibility. And you can read it in several Old Testament passages. For instance, Exodus 33. Moses asked God to reveal himself so that he will know God and God's ways. And again, that was on the mountain, Mount Sinai. And God says that he will. He says, I will cause my goodness to pass by in front of you. And then 2 times that verb is used. God's glory passes by Moses. And there's another instance in 1 Kings 19. Elijah is on the mountain. Elijah's kind of depressed at this point. It was after his battle with the prophets of Baal in chapter 18. And it says that God says, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. So in these Old Testament passages, God passes by. He passes by people in order to make himself known to them. So could it be that what Mark is saying is not that Jesus was just going to walk on by them, but that Jesus was revealing himself as the one in whom the God of Israel is bringing about his plans and purposes? That God was revealing his glory in Jesus. And that Jesus was showing himself as the one who would go ahead of them and make a pathway through the sea.
And they
By
thought
the
he
way,
was a ghost.
was that?
And they thought he was a ghost.
Yeah, and they think he's a ghost, which is a funny part of this whole story. So he's there demonstrating his glory. And by the way, he's walking on the water, which reminds us of the Exodus again, passing through the sea, and then the passing by, which is also part of Exodus. And so Jesus might be revealing his glory. And then, Bud, you point to this interesting thing. Here's the disciples. By the way, this is not the first time they've witnessed the calming of a stormy sea. Remember chapter 4, we've already saw that. Here they're being challenged, and the disciples continue to show their inability to grasp who Jesus is. And they take him as a ghost. The word in Greek is a phantom. They think he's a phantom.
Mhm.
And it says that they not only at a phantom, and they saw him in verse 50. They cry out, and what else?
We're troubled.
They were troubled, or other translations of that word?
Terrified.
Terrified.
Terrified. That sounds a little bit like fear, right?
Yeah.
Which remembers when Jesus says, do not fear, but have faith. He's been contrasting in the past this fear and faith. And here his disciples are not demonstrating faith. They are demonstrating fear. And that's why Jesus immediately tells them, it says, immediately he spoke to them, take heart. It is I, do not be afraid. So first of all, he tells them to take heart, take courage. The second part of this is important. I'm not a phantom, he says. Instead, he says, in Greek, the word is ego eimi. In one sense, that could be a simple self-identification. Hey, it's me. But on another level, if you take that literally in Greek, the word is I am.
Okay.
So take heart. I am. Do not be afraid. In other words, take heart. I am. I am God. I am the Lord. Remember when I am was the phrase when Moses in Exodus chapter 13 says, who should I tell them sent me? And the Lord appears to him and says, I am that I am. This is the identification of the Lord, Yahweh in the Old Testament. And here's Jesus taking that identification and saying, I am. And what God did in the Old Testament now, Jesus is doing in the New Testament. And this then is Jesus pointing to his lordship and pointing to the fact that he is I am. So don't be afraid, I am. And Jesus says, Jesus got in the boat and the wind ceased. And then we get to this point that Jan, you were asking about, right?
Yes.
So he's caused the wind to cease, and despite all that they have seen, and they've seen a lot, they've went out on missions with Jesus, they've healed, they've seen Jesus drive out evil spirits, and they've seen Jesus heal people. They themselves have went out and ministered in his name. They've saw him miraculously feed 5,000 men, and they have seen him calm the natural elements. But despite all that, it doesn't say they had faith. It uses this other word that often is used of the crowds and others, and that is that they were astounded, which does not mean that they had faith at all. It just means they're kind of intrigued. But Mark goes a little further than that, and he tells us why this was the case. Why was it that they didn't have faith? Why is it that they were utterly astounded? And the fact is that they did not understand about the loaves, or their hearts were hardened. So it's taking us back not to the miracle that just occurred, but to the miracle that occurred prior to this on the other side of the sea and the feeding of the 5,000. What is it that they failed to grasp about the loaves, first of all, do you think?
They may have been thinking only of themselves when they were over there because they were hungry and they wanted the people to go away so that they could go get the people could feed themselves and they could get something, and maybe they couldn't get out of that rut.
Mm-hmm. So their mindset was on themselves and not really caring for the people. So that's part of it, I think. I think their mindset is a failure to grasp that part of Jesus as one who is reaching out to others. So I think that's part of it. What else do you think they might have failed to grasp? Remember the first story when they were on the sea? And the question that they asked back in This was chapter 4. Verse 40, Jesus said to them in chapter 4:40, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? There's that contrast between fear and faith, by the way. They were filled with great awe. They said to one another, who then is this, that even the wind and waves obey him? They don't grasp who Jesus is. They should have grasped it back then, and they should have grasped it in the feeding of the 5,000, that Jesus is the one through whom God's kingdom has come. Jesus is the one that has come to feed us and to provide the nourishment that we need, and who is ultimately going to lead to the great feast. And I think that's part of what those leftovers are pointing to, this great banquet of God that Jesus points to in the feeding of the 5,000. That all of this has come in Jesus, and yet they fail to grasp who Jesus is.
They are reluctant learners.
Yeah. They haven't gotten it, even though they've seen so much.
They
And
sound
they're
all
not going to
too,
get it for a while, by the way.
they sound all too real.
That was a spoiler alert. But they're all too real, Bud says. They remind us of ourselves, I think.
Mhm.
Which I think is part of why Mark portrays the disciples in such a way, is that we will see ourselves in the disciples, and that we will see our own lack of faith, and that we'll come to terms with how crazy that lack of faith is.
Yeah.
So that's,
Maybe that serves to show how important faith is. That it's an intangible something that is to be sought after.
yeah. The importance of faith is this thing that we are called to have. And that's been part of what, Jesus has said from the beginning about faith, right? When we said that believe in the good news, he's talking about having faith in the good news. That's what Jesus is all about. Even from his first sermon, is faith, and the failure to really grasp who he is and what he's doing is a true lack of faith. But so that tells us about the first part. Okay, the disciples don't get it; they're a little dull. But the second part of that phrase, verse 52, which does seem a little troubling, that their hearts were hardened. A couple observations on that, and maybe we can try to unpack a little bit of this. This isn't the first time that hearts have been hardened. Do you remember the other time so far in Mark's gospel when hearts were hardened? It's in chapter 3. And clearly, I have written down the wrong verse there.
It's in. Wait a minute, I saw it.
Okay, it's in verse
5.
3:5. Yeah, I put verse 3:15, and that was wrong.
Yeah.
3:5. This is he's in the synagogue, and he was grieved at their hardness of heart. Who's he talking to here?
The Pharisees.
Yep. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to that man, stretch out your hand. So their hearts are hard, which hardness of heart also points back to what Old Testament character?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh, which by the way is another Exodus overtone, right? Pharaoh, and his heart is hardened. Who hardened Pharaoh's heart?
God.
So in one sense, it was God, right?
But I think Pharaoh's heart was already hardened, and then God just kind of sealed it.
Yeah. There's this sense in which Pharaoh chooses, right, not to do it, and then God makes his heart harder. And it kind of is what happens, I think, in that story. Which raises an interesting question here. This is a passive verb. It doesn't say they hardened their hearts. it says their hearts were hardened.
I have a real problem with this. Hardened doesn't mean, it's not a verb. It is that their hearts were not open. That's the way I interpret it. In fact, that's the only way it makes sense to me.
The hearts were not opened. Yeah. Which gets at the idea for sure, right? That this is what's happening here. But who is it that's causing this?
Maybe it's not yet time for them to understand.
Maybe there's a timing issue, huh?
Yeah.
That's one possibility.
That would mean Jesus was doing it. Or
Yeah.
God.
God. Sometimes that's what we see when we see these kind of verbs, is that it's this idea of God. Actually, when it's passive verbs, often God is the one doing the action. So that is a possibility. I was just wanting to look too. I'm also struck by these words of Isaiah when he has that call that they're to keep looking and not to keep listening but not comprehend, to keep looking but not understanding, so that their minds will be dull and their ears stopped and their eyes shut. And I wonder if some of that's what's happening here to the disciples as well, is that they're in some sense just like those people that Isaiah was called to go and preach to, and yet the more they heard, the more their minds became dull, and they became closed to that. I wonder if, you know, and it all goes back to how you see even like Pharaoh in the Old Testament. And I'm like you, Susan. I see Pharaoh as kind of choosing that path of hardening. And as a result, because he had chosen to resist God, then God caused him to close his heart even more in that sense. And I think that might be what's happening here. And so I think it points us to the possibility that even those who are the closest to God can be just like Pharaoh was, that we can choose to not open ourselves to the work of God in our midst. And as a result, we find that our hearts become so hardened. We close our hearts so much to the work of God that we're unable to see it, no matter how many times it's right in front of us. And so I think what's happened here is the disciples have seen so much, and yet they still haven't believed. And as a result, their hearts are becoming hardened.
And we saw that in Hebrews too, where it says, you know, when you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts like those in the wilderness.
That's right. And yeah, and he was the author of Hebrews was quoting from Isaiah 95. Today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as they did, and be disobedient. So yeah, I think that's the same way, that we can hear God's voice and we can either choose to accept what God is doing and accept who God is, or we reject that. And as we continue to reject that, it causes us to become further hardened and stubborn in some sense to recognizing what God is doing in our midst.
I wonder if they were watching and listening, but not searching.
Unpack
Because
that.
it says they were astounded, for they didn't understand about the loaves, and they didn't understand about him walking on the water. They were astounded because they weren't thinking
Mark sets this all up
positively.
right with that chapter.
I think that's part of it, right? Is they were missing what was really happening, and they were unable to take the clues that Jesus was giving them, even the things that Jesus says here, I am, even the actions that he's doing that were pointing to, this is the fact that God is at work in him, just as God was at work in the Old Testament, and yet they're missing all those signs and those clues. I think that's part of it, is that it's their failure to look beyond the miracle to see the meaning behind the miracle. And we've seen that, throughout Mark's gospel, that people that have believe in Jesus just because of the miracles, that's not a belief that is an enduring belief. The
There you
enduring
go.
belief comes to those who see the miracle, but then understand who Jesus is because of the miracle.
Yep.
And that's the thing, that they're seeing the miracles, but they're failing to understand the message behind the miracle.
I'm wondering too about being willing to accept the fact that it is a miracle. And that's acknowledging that Jesus is God. It's like sometimes if we don't understand something and it defies our human logic, it's like, I'm just going to kind of put that away. I'm not going to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can, we kind of just go with what we get. And if it defies what we don't try to go beyond that. So we just put it over here. Yeah.
Right.
And could we think of that as being spiritually blind?
Yeah, spiritually blind, which I think would summarize how the disciples have been. Spiritually blind or spiritually obtuse or something.
Human.
Yep, Jack.
I don't usually say much, but I like the way Mark has set this all up. In the verse 30, the apostles gathered themselves together and told him all things, what they had done and what they had taught. And I think that at that very moment, Mark is saying they didn't learn.
Yeah.
They didn't learn what. And so we're going to have this story where he's again trying to teach them what it really means.
Mm.
We blessed few. The 5,000 means nothing. It's all about us.
Yeah. Yeah, they see themselves in that way. And I think you're right. This is pointing to the fact that they thought they had it all together in verse 30, right? What they had done and what they had taught. And the fact is that they don't even know. They don't get it. And so this is totally pointing, I think, to that fact of their failure to get it from when they were sent out and onward. And yet the amazing thing here is that God is still having grace on them and is still using them and is still reaching out to them. And so I think the other point here is that just because we don't get it, and even when our hearts might be hardened or closed, God doesn't give up. He keeps working, and there's still hope. And I think that's the great message of God's grace at work here. The other thing I love about how Mark sets this in relief, the disciples, it ends with they didn't understand and their hearts are hard. But then verse 53, when they crossed over to the other side, he's recognized by the people and they're running to him. They're bringing sick people to him. And those people recognize that Jesus is the bearer of this unique authority and power. And they have almost this unconditional trust. Contrast that with the terror of the disciples, right? With the fear of the disciples. And here, in a difference of how the disciples were crying out, here are people that believe that even touching just his garment, just the hem of his garment will heal the sick. So these crowds who assemble around Jesus, they haven't witnessed the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. They haven't witnessed Jesus's authority over the stormy sea. And yet they believe that touching him could make them well. And the truth is that they are correct. And the disciples who saw both of those miracles plus are unable to comprehend any of it and have only a lack of understanding and fear. Pretty interesting how Mark draws kind of that relief of this is the disciples don't get it. And even these crowds are able to somewhat understand who Jesus is. Other thoughts or observations? Jan, did that make any sense of that hardness of heart part for you?
Yeah, I think it got the fog kind of lifted.
Yeah. That's a tough one, I think, in general terms. So, other thoughts or questions or observations? So we'll be looking in chapter 7. Now we'll see Jesus comes back to kind of the Pharisees and the scribes, and continues to have some interaction with them as we go forward.
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know what sea that Jesus walked on in this passage. Does anyone know what sea that would have been?
I have in my Bible, I have a little map. It's I have a Life Application Study Bible, King James Version. And by the way, recommended by Pastor Matthew, right? And there's a map at the bottom of that page, and it shows the Sea of Galilee, and Bethsaida is on one side or one end of it. And I don't know how to pronounce it. How did we pronounce that earlier? Gennesaret?
Gennesaret.
Is on the more or less on the other side or other corner. So apparently they were on the Sea of Galilee from that map and the text.
Okay,
Thanks, Jack.
Well,
thank you.
I just had to see. I didn't.
That too would account for the wind that the disciples were feeling there, because quite often the Sea of Galilee has winds and waves on it because of where it lies between the mountains.
Which would show us Jesus being up on a mountain too. So
yeah,
that would all connect. The whole idea of being on the sea. That's the other thing that really in all this passage, you're really getting this idea of Jesus is bringing about this new Exodus, and pointing to the fact that Jesus is bringing about this salvation, that just as Jesus saved the people of Israel in the Old Testament and brought them out of Egypt to the promised land, so now Jesus is bringing all of us out of the sin of slavery of sin and into the promised land of new life. And it's a beautiful way in which all of these Old Testament allusions really help us to see that.